one more time, because I believe his perspective on these things and the interconnectedness that mushrooms share with everything, including us. He makes a very eloquent and thoughtful sort of plea for understanding and awareness. Now you can Google Paul Stamets, and you can find some of his TED Talks on YouTube. They're really fascinating, but this will give you an idea of where he's at. So what he says is that plants and mushrooms have intelligence, and they want us to take care of the environment, and so they communicate that to us in a way we can understand. He believes that these mushrooms carry this psilocybin as a way of communicating with us through neurology. That in fact they are so intelligent that they are communicating with not only just humans but the entire environment around them. And he says that they want to communicate with us humans, since we are the most populous bipedal organisms walking around, and some plants and fungi are especially interested in enlisting our support. I think they have a consciousness and are constantly trying to direct our evolution by speaking out to us biochemically. We just need to be better listeners. Mushrooms, he says, have taught me the interconnectedness of all life forms and the molecular matrix that we share. I no longer feel that I am in this envelope of a human life called Paul Stamets. I am part of the stream of molecules that are flowing through nature. I am given a voice, given consciousness for a time, but I feel that I am part of this continuum of stardust into which I am born and to which I will return at the end of this life. And this is his idea of, or his sense of the truth and who we really are. These mystical experiences that he's had, and others who have participated in the Hopkins experiment using psilocybin, which we've talked about quite a bit on the show already, also had experiences like this. And he says, I think psilocybes have given me new insight that may allow me to help steer and speed fungal evolution so that we can find solutions to our problems. Especially in a time of ecological crisis, he suggests we can't afford to wait for evolution unfolding at its normal pace. So he talks about what's called the patterning factor, which is something that is talked about in research on these psychedelic drugs in particular. Depatterning is this idea that you are so patterned into ways of behaving that it takes a force, like a hallucinogenic kind of drug or a mystical experience, to break through and depattern you and help you to see better ways of being. That's, in a nutshell, is what that means, depatterning. So Mr. Stamets straddles the sort of borderline between science and mysticism in a way that actually is a throwback to older kinds of science, including the kinds of science and scientists that were around in the early days of the theory of evolution and the idea that science didn't negate creativity, imagination, nature, but that science could drill down on a small part of it. And so in his book, How to Change Your Mind, which we've been dealing with quite a bit, Michael Pollan, who interviewed Paul Stamets quite extensively for the book, found that he saw a correlation between Paul Stamets and a 19th century German scientist by the name of Alexander von Humboldt, who, as he says, revolutionized our understanding of the natural world. Humboldt believed it is only with our feelings, our senses, and our imaginations, that is, with the faculties of human subjectivity, that we can ever penetrate nature's secrets. Nature, everywhere, speaks to man in a voice that is familiar to his soul. There is an order and beauty organizing the system of nature, a system that Humboldt called cosmos. But it would never have revealed itself to us if not for the human imagination, which is itself, of course, a product of nature, of the very system it allows us to comprehend. The modern conceit of the scientist attempting to observe nature with perfect objectivity, as if from a vantage located outside it, would have been anathema to Humboldt. I, myself, am identical with nature. Now, isn't that fascinating? This is from a scientist in the 19th century, and this was not an unusual perspective in those times. Other scientists, including Goethe and Darwin, also have that same sort of belief in connectedness. And it's interesting that he sees Mr. Stamets as a throwback to that kind of science. I think all of science is going to take that step back. Actually, I believe it's more of a step forward, as we understand more through the new breakthroughs in quantum physics. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, the fact that we really cannot observe with perfect objectivity ever, but that in fact we are one with, we are influencing everything we observe. I think more and more science and scientists are going to have to say, I myself am identical with nature. And this modern conceit, as Michael Pollan calls it, of believing that you can observe nature with perfect objectivity, is going to eventually have to fall by the wayside. It's already been disproven, but so much of scientific research is built around that concept that it's so ingrained they don't know how to let go of it. Which really puts scientific research in somewhat of a crisis, if you will, because the approaches that are necessary to really fully understand the most important mysteries in our world aren't going to respond to that traditional, the old-fashioned scientific method. It has to change. But anyway, I digress a bit. So Stamets believes mushrooms are sort of the Earth's internet. They are speaking to us, as he says. He also sees them as the neurological network of nature and forest's immune system. And he's shown how these mushrooms can spread out and grow, and their fungi can actually help roll back decades of pollution and wear and tear on the planet. He's a big supporter of using mushrooms to help protect and clean the environment. And again, you can see him talk about those topics on YouTube if you're interested. So, as Mr. Pollan writes in his book, instead of seeing nature as a collection of discrete objects, the Romantic scientists, and I include Stamets in their number, saw a densely tangled web of subjects, each acting on the other in the great dance that would come to be called coevolution. Everything, Humboldt said, is interaction and reciprocal. They could see this dance of subjectivities because they cultivated the plant's eye view, the animal's eye view, the microbe's eye view, and the fungus' eyes view. Perspectives that depend as much on imagination as observation. And I believe that is where science is heading, or has to go back to. Alright, so I think that's a good place to leave our discussion on mushrooms. And so now let's review those two topics that were very popular at the beginning of the year. The first one had to do with the positive benefits of being alone. Now, there's a nice article on Psychology Today, which I'll repost on my Facebook page, which is Metaphysical Media. You can just type that in on Facebook and it'll bring that page up. Society doesn't help us with this either. For many of us, alone feels like a negative state of being and often carries a social stigma implying isolation or being on the outside. This perceived sense of aloneness seems to imply that being oneself is not volitional, that it's not a choice we make, but rather an imposed state, where a person is not socially engaged in the way that is somehow expected. Even further, it may imply that there is something actually wrong or defective with a person who remains alone. Social media gives us the impression, the illusion, that we are connected, even if it's only interacting with somebody's words. Clicking like is the abbreviated form of saying, I hear you and agree. Comments serve as conversation, as if we had really interacted with that person in real time. Without this connection through devices that keep us informed to the minute, we may feel anxious that we will be left alone and left out there. Certainly a lot of anxiety these days around social media. But the article goes on to say, I believe that most of us really know in our hearts of hearts that our constant focus on this kind of communication deprives us of having real human interaction. Even more importantly, this kind of communication may keep us from having meaningful communion with ourselves. Unlike being alone, loneliness often implies that you are looking for someone or something that you feel you need in order to feel secure and happy. For some, loneliness may be a chronic condition, where your own company is never enough, where spending time with yourself may produce anxiety and sometimes worse symptoms such as panic attacks and depression. For many, the perceived solution to keep this fear away is to make sure you are always in the company of another. Of course, loneliness is not one size fits all. There are many different kinds of it. Some may be reminders of loss and abandonment, or feeling rejected. But there's an important difference between being alone and being lonely. And being alone does not equal loneliness. You can learn to be alone and not be lonely. In fact, you can learn to be alone and have a wonderful relationship with yourself. You can learn to think